Buonasera, benvenuti a Giovedì Scienza.
Good evening, and welcome to Giovedì Scienza, Science on Thursday. Thank you very much for this round of applause, which is for Alex Bellos, who is this evening's guest. But allow me also to welcome all the friends that are following us streaming. There are more and more of them. As you know, we're also connected both on the web but also with Venice. The people who are following us live from the Future Center of the phone company in Venice, the Telecom Italia one, and where we talk about telecommunications of the future put into practice. And now I would like to ask a professor of Franco Pastrone of the University of Turin, who's also the president of the Subalpina Mathesis, as a maths association, to join us here. He's also the founder of the Peano Prize, which is a wonderful prize that could only have been established in Turin because it's to honor Peano, who's a great mathematician straddling two centuries, the 19th and 20th century. And he was great also on a human level. Giuseppe Peano was always in favor of peace, universal values, and he always was in favor of universal government. We know how very difficult it is to have a government here, a national one, let alone a universal one. And he also wanted to invent a universal language. It was like a new Esperanto based on Latin with no declensions. This idea of universalism and peace is something which he wrote about in an article in the Gazzetta del Popolo. And the Gazzetta del Popolo was the first paper I ever worked for, so I'm very pleased. And now let us see Alex Bellos, who's been awarded the Peano Prize by Franco Pastrone.
Signore e signori, io vi ringrazio intanto per la presenza numerosa, come sempre, che fa onore.
You, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being so many here this evening. This honors both the prize, the conference. Dr. Bellos. Dr. Bellos is not an academic. He's a journalist of The Guardian, but he graduated in maths and philosophy and also, in fact, did a paper on piano, so he's well acquainted with piano. I have only one. We always have to thank people, but very few people have to be thanked this year because no one gave us a penny. So thank yourself because stubbornly you have continued with the prize. And obviously I would also like to thank Giovedì Scienza, Pino Zappalà, Laura Celeghin, and Piero Bernucci, who have been working on it and made it possible. And now I would like to give, if you, Alex Bellos would like to join me here.
Oh, wow. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Franco, fermati ancora un secondo perché io vorrei...
Franco, please stay with us for a second because I would like to say that this is the first year in which this Peano Prize is awarded basically to somebody who, rather than working as a mathematician, has popularized maths. But I would also like to recall how many important mathematicians have been awarded the prize. Yes, I was going to say it, but early dementia, senior moment. The list of those who've won it is very, very important in the world of maths and also of popularization. And popularization might not be the right term to use, but those who've written about maths, there's a long history. If anybody had given us more money next year, maybe we could have done, organized something with previous winners. But in any case, we've had Kate Daving, Ian Stewart, Alan Cohn, who was the Fields Medal. But the difference between the Fields and the Abel Prize is that the Fields is every 4 years, so to a mathematician who's under 40 and no money. It's just a medal. While the Abel Prize is a prize which is a bit like the Nobel one, about half the Nobel Prize, isn't it? Yes, while the Field is a very prestigious, but absolutely no. In any case, it's a gold medal. It's golden. I'm not sure whether it's gold or golden. I don't know. I really don't. In any case. There's a big difference. I think the Able Prize was established about 5 years ago, not so long ago. Both of them are very important. And I was at the Academy of Science on Monday, and on Monday we'll be talking about the Nobel Prize and the Able Prize. Thank you very much, Professor Pastrone. And a few words now on Alex Bellos. So you've heard something already. He is somebody specialized in communication, but he graduated in maths, and he has written about maths on The Guardian, which is a very important British daily, and on the BBC. So I would say that communication prevails in him, but the mathematician is hidden there too. With a very many difference, I think he'll talk about ethnomathematics in particular, because his journeys have taken him around the world to see what numbers mean for the various civilizations, the various philosophies in the world. Hence the title of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to say it's a great pleasure to be here in Turin, Torino. I've never been here before, and it's a beautiful city. So I'm Alex Bellos, and just want to give you a bit of a background of who I am and where I come from. So I studied mathematics at university. I loved mathematics as a child, but I also like writing and I like books. So I went to university to study mathematics and philosophy. But I got distracted by newspapers and journalism. So after university, I left mathematics and for about 15 years was a journalist. I started off at a small newspaper in Brighton in the south of England. Then I went to The Guardian, which was my dream to work for a big London newspaper. And then I moved to South America as the foreign correspondent for The Guardian. Then I came back to London, and I didn't really know what to do. So I thought, why don't I look back at my first love, mathematics, but look back with the eyes of a foreign correspondent. So I decided to travel to the world of mathematics as a foreign correspondent. And this was not just an abstract idea into mathematical ideas. I wanted to go on geographical journeys. So I spent 1 year going around the world. I went to France, to Germany, to America. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about experiences that I had in India and in Japan. So, where do you start when you want to write about mathematics? You start with 1. And I became interested not just in mathematics, but in the psychology of mathematics. Where do numbers come from? And what I want to do now is conduct an experiment of quite a new field of numerical cognition. And this is the simplest experiment, the most famous experiment, and I will show you a number of dots on the screen, and you will tell me how many dots you see. So this is easy. 1. Thank you. That's 3, yeah? Okay, the point, obviously, is that when I show you 1, 2, 3, and 4, it feels instant. But then when I show you 23, it takes a long time. Now, actually, if we were in a lab and I was timing you properly, we would see that with 1 dot, 2 dots, and 3 dots, it really is instant. But with 4 dots, we start to do something else. We actually start to count. So there is a small bit of time that we need extra for the 4 dots. If there were 5 dots, there'd be another little bit. 6 dots, a little bit. And these little bits add up so that when they're 23, you really notice it. Well, this is interesting because it shows that there are 2 ways of understanding numbers. Either to subitize, to instantly see it, or to count. And, well, why is this interesting? This is culturally very interesting. It shows us, for example, these are 3 numeral systems. This is India from about 1,500 years ago. These are the kanji characters in contemporary China and also in Japan. And this is a type of numbers from somewhere where I think you probably know. And what you see very clearly is that 1, 2, and 3 can be 1, 2, and 3 lines. But 4 is never 4 lines, because it would be a terrible system. Because we'd have to be doing something extra. Now, one time I was giving a talk like this in a nice old building in England, and there was a big clock on the side of the wall with the numbers in Roman numerals. And for 4, it was I. And I was saying, this seems to disprove everything that I'm saying. But actually, it confirms what I was saying. It is actually true that the Romans used to use I on clock faces. But that's because the position tells us what the number is. So I is more aesthetic, it's more beautiful. So that's why it was used. But for the purposes of counting, IV was used. Now, let's look at India a bit closer. This is one numeral system that emerged in India about 1,500 years ago. Now, imagine if you had to write this without taking your pencil off the paper. Well, if they had pencils, then yeah, you would get this. I think you probably recognize it. This was the origin of what we call Arab numerals. So they're not actually Arab numerals because they came from India first. We should call them Indian numerals. Why do we use Indian numerals? It's not because of 1, 2, and 3, and 4. It's because of something else. It's because India was where 0 was invented. Like there's a joke in England and in India, which I hope is translatable, which is, what has India given the world? Nothing. That's right. Niente nulla is a bit different. But actually, nothing is the greatest gift possible that any civilization has maybe given humanity. Because 0 made counting possible for everybody. Have you ever tried to count or to calculate using Roman numerals
i numeri romani.
is very difficult, and no one really did it. Only professionals did it.
Erano dei professionisti quelli che lo facevano anche all'epoca.
Whereas as children, we all learn how to calculate with Indian or Arab numerals.
Utilizzare i numeri indiani e arabi, insomma.
And the reason why it's easy is because India invented, or India, in fact, it used a positional system.
Un sistema che si basa sulla posizione, la collocazione.
And when you have a positional system,
Quando c'è un sistema che si basi sulla collocazione,
you need to have a symbol
bisogna avere un
for
simbolo
when there's nothing in that position.
per spiegare che non c'è nulla in quella particolare posizione.
And other civilizations had positional systems.
Avevano dei sistemi che si basavano sulla posizione, sulla collocazione.
In Babylon, or not,
Babilonia,
for instance, they just put a mark
e lì mettevano
for
un
zero.
segnetto, e quello era come uno zero.
But this was just a mark. It wasn't a proper number.
Non era un numero vero e proprio.
In India, they raised the profile of this symbol for zero into a proper number.
Questo simbolo e lo hanno trasformato in un numero.
So a number, you can add zero,
Vuol dire che si può sommare,
you can multiply by zero.
moltiplicare per zero.
Division by zero is a bit more complicated,
Divisioni per zero sono tutte più complicate,
but you
ma
can still treat zero
comunque
as a
si può
proper number.
trattare lo zero come fosse un numero vero e proprio.
Now, to me, this was
Ora,
very interesting.
questo era molto interessante.
Why was
Mi
it
ha
in
affascinato
India
perché
where zero became a number?
il numero è diventato
Why not in
è
Babylon?
diventato un numero. E perché non a Babilone? Perché non è successo?
What about in ancient Rome or ancient Greece who were so great at mathematics?
Nella Grecia antica che aveva matematici così famosi, o a Roma.
But the Greeks, they didn't understand zero.
I greci non capivano lo zero.
They didn't understand zero because they had a geometric understanding of mathematics.
Una comprensione geometrica della matematica.
And if there's nothing is nothing, so there's nothing to write about.
Niente, quindi non devo scrivere nulla per indicarlo.
So I put on my foreign correspondent hat.
Sono diventato il corrispondente estero,
I telephoned the travel agent,
ho telefonato alla gente
and I flew to India to find out.
in India per scoprire.
So who did I go to see?
E chi sono andato a trovare?
I went to see this man here.
Niente di strano.
He's the Shankaracharya, which is, it's like a priest. He's a high priest of Hinduism. So the guy on the right is the Shankaracharya of Puri. And he's one of the most holy men in Hinduism. There are just 4 of them in India, and one in each corner of India. And he is also the head of what is called Vedic mathematics, which is an Indian approach to numbers. So I thought he would be a good person to ask.
Ho pensato che sarebbe stata la persona giusta a cui parlare,
But
ma
I can only see him in the temple, and in the temple, he is only allowed to speak in Hindi.
nel tempio può soltanto parlare in hindi.
So he has his disciple, and I need to speak to his disciple in English.
Parlare in inglese al suo discepolo,
The disciple speaks in Hindi.
il discepolo traduceva,
The answer comes back in Hindi,
la risposta veniva data
and then back to me in English.
poi in lingua tradotta.
Now, this taught me, there's another mathematical concept of the geometrical progression,
Quello della progressione geometrica.
something that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Because I asked the question in English, small little question,
La domandina piccola,
the translation into Hindi
azioni in hindi,
took like 2 minutes.
2 minuti di parole,
The reply took about 5 minutes,
5 minuti,
and the translation of the reply, 10 minutes.
10 minuti.
So by the time the reply had got back to me,
Nel momento in cui ho avuto la risposta,
it was gigantic
era enorme,
and had nothing to do with the question that I asked.
nulla a che fare con la domanda che avevo posto in primo luogo.
And this was crazy because the Shankaracharya speaks perfect English.
Via, perché parlava un inglese perfetto, peraltro.
So after several hours,
Dopo diverse
I was going nowhere.
io mi sono reso conto che
And I came back again.
da nessuna parte. E a questo punto sono
In fact,
ritornato un altro.
I came back several times,
Sono tornato diverse
and
volte.
each time the interview went on for hours,
Il colloquio andava avanti ore e ore.
and I was getting nowhere. So I decided on a different approach.
Allora ho deciso di avere un approccio diverso.
I zoned out.
Fondamentalmente
And I started just staring at him.
ho cominciato a fissare.
If we could have the picture back.
Potete per favore rimettermi, ecco,
So I was staring at him and I saw that
fissando e ho visto
each time I saw him, he was wearing the same robe.
che lo vedevo, indossava gli stessi abiti.
I knew that for lunch, he always has exactly the same curry
Esattamente lo stesso caso,
with no spice.
senza spezie,
In his room, he just has a bed with no furniture.
senza mobili.
People were coming in and lying on the floor, giving him gifts,
Per terra, dandogli doni.
like a fruit. And he would just pick the fruit and give it to someone else.
Dava a qualcun altro.
And I realized that
Mi sono reso conto a quel punto
this man, the Shankaracharya, is the embodiment of nothing.
Acharya è colui che incorpora il nulla, che rappresenta
Everything about Hinduism
tutto ciò che riguarda l'induismo,
is about the nothing.
riguarda il niente,
It's about letting go, about giving away,
lasciare andare,
about having nothing.
non avere nulla, non possedere nulla.
And in fact, it's this mystical idea of nothingness
Della nullità, del niente, del nulla
that created the context
che crea il contesto.
for the development and the invention of zero in India.
Si è potuto sviluppare lo zero in India.
So zero, mathematical zero,
Lo zero matematico,
is a mathematical interpretation
interpretazione matematica
of a religious idea.
di un'idea religiosa.
And it's interesting because we tend to think in the modern day
Al giorno d'oggi,
that religion and science are in conflict.
in realtà sono in conflitto tra di loro.
But actually, the history is a lot more complicated.
La storia ci insegna che tutto ciò è molto più complicato.
And if it wasn't for the Indian mysticism,
Per il misticismo indiano,
we would not have
noi non
science
avremmo
really,
la scienza,
because only with Indian zero
perché soltanto con lo zero indiano
could numbers properly become the tools of science.
sono diventati gli strumenti della scienza.
Now, another thing I discovered when I was in India,
Mentre in India
they invented, as well as zero,
inventato oltre lo zero
the zero currency note.
la moneta che vale zero.
Now, this was invented by a non-governmental organization
Una ONG
campaigning against
che
bribery,
campagna contro la corruzione.
because you need to bribe a lot in India. And so they
C'è molta corruzione.
printed these so you would bribe someone with nothing.
Moneta, questa carta moneta, in modo tale che si poteva corrompere qualcuno con niente.
And I think that
Ed io penso
it's rather lovely that
che sia molto bello.
here again we see nothing
Ancora una volta,
is something.
nulla, niente, è qualcosa.
And maybe you think I'm emphasizing this idea that nothing is something, and it seems so obvious,
Niente sia qualcosa.
but it's a really difficult idea.
Ma è un'idea molto difficile da concettualizzare.
So the Greeks
I greci
didn't have it, and no one before then.
e nessuno prima di loro.
Now, if we think about
Ora, se pensiamo
India and Indian numerals,
India, i numeri indiani,
they emerged about 1,500 years ago
dicevo, sono apparsi circa 1500 anni fa.
and took 500 or 600 years before they got to Europe.
Circa 500-600 anni prima che giungessero in Europa.
But before Indian numerals, there were Roman numerals.
Erano quelli i romani,
There were Greek numerals,
i greci,
which were the same as Greek letters.
che erano come le lettere.
There were Hebrew numerals, which were Hebrew letters. There were Egyptian numerals,
Utilizzavano le lettere o quelle egiziane,
Phoenician,
fenici.
all the way back
Insomma, possiamo tornare indietro.
until the original, the very first symbols, the very first number system.
Il primo sistema numerico.
Now, when I was learning mathematics, I didn't know any of this stuff.
Quando io stavo studiando
I assumed
sapevo tutto questo.
that numbers are as old as the hills.
Che i numeri esistessero, e come si dice in inglese, fossero vecchi come le montagne.
But actually, they were a really recent invention in human thought,
Molto recente.
only about 8,000 to 9,000 years old.
8.000 anni, 9.000 anni forse.
And they were discovered
E sono stati scoperti
or invented. That's another big debate. But for a philosophy class. In Sumer, or Sumeria, which is in Iraq. And why and how did numbers evolve? Without numbers, just say you had 30 sheep, and your sheep were in the fields, and then you went to the city and you wanted to say, I have 30 sheep to sell, or something like that. How could you say it? Maybe you had a stick, and you would have 30 lines in the stick. Or maybe you had pebbles, and you had 30 pebbles and you lined them up. This is how many I've got. Or maybe you had to say sheep 30 times, like I have sheep, 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 sheep. Yeah. It's not very efficient. So what they devised was a system of small clay pieces with symbols on. And these symbols emerged as being basically the first system that we had for numbers. We had words and symbols within the same system. So numbers were an invention of the accountants of Sumeria. But not only was this the beginning of numbers, this was the beginning of all writing systems. So the systems of script in the Western world begins with numbers. We would have no books and written literature if it wasn't for numbers. Now, what is a number? Because before we invented these things called numbers, we could still count. We still knew if we were 10 of us in our tribe and we meet 100 in another tribe, we know we have to run away because there's more of them than us. It turns out that numbers we think is one simple concept. It's actually the combination of two concepts. And the two concepts are cardinality and ordinality, which is the same thing as amount and position. So, for instance, on the front row there are 4 empty seats. The 4 seats, that's quantity. But when I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm not counting quantity. 4 just means it's what comes after 3 and before 5. So I was thinking about this idea. How can I tell a story about the origin of numbers? And then I discovered that there are chimpanzees in Japan who have learnt how to use numbers. So I called the travel agent and I said, get me a ticket to Japan. And I flew to meet these incredible chimpanzees. So how do you teach a chimpanzee numbers? You need to teach them ordinality and cardinality. And you use this using a touchscreen computer. And what's interesting is that in the West and in America and Europe, people are also interested in chimpanzees. But in the 70s and the 80s, all the research was really about language. can chimpanzees understand language?
La domanda era, sono in grado di comprendere il nostro linguaggio?
Basically, they can't.
E fondamentalmente la risposta è no. Non
But
sono in
in
grado.
Japan,
Ma in Giappone
they were much more interested in
invece erano
can
più
chimpanzees
interessati
understand
a
numbers?
sapere se gli scimpanzé erano in grado di contare, di comprendere i numeri.
So they developed these
Hanno
computers
sviluppato questi computer
and these tasks.
e una serie di compiti che questi animali dovevano svolgere.
In order to teach them cardinality,
Per potergli
they would
insegnare
put several different boxes
mettevano
on the
diverse
screen.
scatole o quadratini sullo
One
schermo.
box would have one
Per esempio,
pencil,
c'era
or
una matita
the
dentro,
next one would have
poi
two,
due matite,
and then three.
poi tre matite,
And then they'd put the symbol, say, for
poi
three,
mettevano il simbolo di tre.
and the chimpanzee needed to look at the correct box and touch the correct number.
Toccare il numero che corrispondeva alla posizione di quella scatola o quadratino.
Or look at the number
O guardare
and
il
then
numero
press the
e
box
poi
that had the right
vedere,
quantity.
per esempio, la rappresentazione del numero corrispondente.
The chimpanzees learned this quite easily. Within a couple of years, they were very competent
Dopo un paio d'anni gli scimpanzé sono diventati molto bravi a questo, molto
in
competenti.
quantity.
E quindi riuscivano a definire le quantità.
In order to teach the chimpanzees ordinality,
Invece loro,
in fact, there's one thing
c'è una cosa
that I've forgotten, is that this is all reward driven.
questo naturalmente è tutto su
When the
ricompensa.
chimpanzee
Quando lo scimpanzé
gets the correct
dà la
answer,
risposta giusta,
the computer goes
appunto il computer
bing,
fa bing,
and a bit of food
un po' di cibo
shoots down.
arriva e quindi lo scimpanzé si
Chimpanzee eats it and he loves it and he wants to do it again.
ne vuole rifare e ne vuole ancora.
If the task is wrong,
Se invece sbaglia,
the computer goes,
ah,
no food,
niente cibo.
doesn't like it.
E allora lo scimpanzé non è niente contento.
And what's interesting
E ciò che è interessante
is that
è che
it is not the case that the cleverest chimpanzees ate more than anyone else and became fatter and fatter, because all the food that they won was subtracted from their lunch afterwards.
tratto dalla quantità di cibo che gli veniva data a pranzo.
So they were clever, but not that clever.
Erano intelligenti, ma non poi così intelligenti.
So with the ordinality tasks,
Comunque, adesso torniamo agli ordinali.
2 digits were flashed on the screen.
C'erano due numeri o due cifre che venivano fatte vedere sullo schermo.
And the chimpanzee had to touch the lower and then the higher.
Il numero più basso e poi il numero più alto.
This, the chimpanzees learned very quickly.
Una cosa che hanno imparato molto rapidamente gli scimpanzé.
So after a couple of years,
Dopo un paio d'anni,
in the 1990s,
negli anni 90,
you could say that,
si poteva dire
and there are about 10 of them, chimpanzees
di questi scimpanzé
understood number
capivano il concetto di numero.
because they understood
Perché?
cardinality and ordinality.
Capivano sia i cardinali che l'ordinale, gli aspetti cardinali e ordinali.
Then
Poi
the professors there,
i professori lì,
they realized they had not taught zero to the chimpanzees.
lo zero.
So they thought, why don't we teach them the
Insegniamo
cardinality of zero,
per esempio la posizione cardinale.
which is that zero is nothing, there's nothing in the box,
Niente, non c'è nulla in quella scatola, la scatola è vuota.
and see if they can deduce
Se sono
the
in grado
ordinality
di dedurre l'ordine,
of
cioè
number.
dedurre dove va questo zero, questo niente della scatola.
So us as humans, we understand
Esseri umani,
that cardinality and ordinality are the same. Not the same, that we slip from one to the other with no problem.
da un sistema all'altro senza grossi.
We know that because zero
Noi sappiamo che
is nothing,
zero è niente,
it becomes
è nulla,
before one.
è prima
in-
dell'uno.
But what would happen to the chimpanzees?
Cosa succede agli scimpanzé?
So teaching them the cardinality of zero was easy.
È facile insegnare.
You have the box with nothing in it,
Cardinale, c'era una scatola vuota, non c'era niente dentro,
and that is the symbol zero.
e quello è il simbolo zero.
And they got that no problem.
L'hanno capito, non c'era.
When you show them the symbol zero, they touch the box with nothing.
Guardavano l'immagine della scatoletta, in
When you show them the box with nothing,
vedere la scatoletta in cui non c'è niente, o l'immagine di
they
questa,
press the symbol zero.
premono sul segno zero.
Then they tried the ordinality task.
Cercato di fargli vedere l'ordine.
two numbers would come up, but sometimes one was a zero. And they watched to see which one the chimpanzee pressed first. And they did this a few dozen times, and they calculated the average of when they got it right and when they got it wrong, of where on the number line did the chimpanzee think that zero was. Between 6 and 7. In other words, had no idea. It was as good as just random choosing. Just didn't understand it. Of course, because they know what is right, because they get the food, they improved. And the position of zero got lower and lower and lower and lower, but it never really got to below 1. They never totally understood that 0 is less than 1. And this to me is a wonderful way to explain that ordinality and cardinality are different. And it is part of being human, which means that we can slip effortlessly between both of them. And that is really the basis of number. And that chimpanzees do not have that depth of understanding. But what happened during this research is that even though they discovered the limits of chimpanzee understanding, they also discovered that in certain things, chimpanzees have a higher cognitive ability than we do. For example, there was this one task with the numbers. They flashed 5 digits on the screen. And after a certain amount of time, the digits became white squares. And the task was to remember the order of numbers and touch them in order. So they started with a group of chimpanzees doing this and a control group of humans. When you could see the digits for 0.67 seconds, chimpanzees no problem, humans no problem. And they reduced the time to 0.43 seconds. The humans are making mistakes. No problem for the chimpanzees. Then they reduced it to 0.21 seconds. Humans now can't do it at all. Chimpanzees, no problem. So I'm going to show you now this task. It is going to take you 10 seconds just to understand what's going on because it is so fast. So here is the back of the chimpanzee, and that's the chimpanzee's finger. He will press that, 5 digits will appear, then after 0.21 seconds, become the squares. And let's see if you can do it. Gets the food and eats. Eats the food. Eats it. Food. Can anyone here do that? In fact, once in England I showed that, and a woman came up to me and said, my husband found that very easy. He could count. Is there any way you think he could make lots of money? And I had no idea. Maybe go and work with chimpanzees. Now, that is 5 digits in 0.21 seconds. And it's a few years old now. Now that chimpanzee can do 8 digits in 0.21 seconds, or 5 digits in 0.09 seconds. Twice as fast as that. And because in Japan, in the lab, or actually they call it the classroom, because when you work very closely with chimpanzees, you treat them like colleagues. They film, and something really strange happened. Yeah, this is the next slide. This is the same test. He's remembering the order of the digits. Press the button. But he gets distracted. For 10 seconds, he's looking away. And he comes back. Can he remember? Absolutely no problem. Then he carries on, gets the food. Now, there are lots of interesting things to observe. Firstly, they have this amazing photographic memory. It stays for at least 10 seconds. But also, as humans, if we were doing this, we would like to position ourselves a little bit away from the screen. The chimpanzee loves having the screen right up to the face. And it's interesting, but you will have to ask an evolutionary biologist why a chimpanzee need these skills in the wild. There's obviously a reason why they are able to do that, and why we as humans have completely lost that skill. Now, when I was in Japan, I wasn't just going to speak to these chimpanzees. I wanted to do some mathematical tourism. Because even though math is the same everywhere, it's the universal language, 2 and 2 is 4 everywhere. A universal language, obviously, whose rules were set by Peano. The culture of numbers, the approach to numbers, is completely different wherever you go. For example, this pre-numbers, when we talk about tallying or counting, this is how we tally in the UK, and I believe in Italy as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in England, we call this the 5-bar gate because it looks like a gate. So when we're playing dominoes and we win 5 times, this is what we do. And this links, it's a fragment almost of our prehistory. Because this is pre-writing. So I assume that everyone does this, all over the world. Not true. In South America, this is what you do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now this is a much better system. Because from what we were seeing before, the difference between 3 lines and 4 lines, we have to think a little bit. Here, the difference between 3 and 4, you don't need to think or do any counting. So if you want to save yourself some mental power, the next time you tally, use the Latin American way. Unless you find the following method even more interesting, which I do.
Il seguente metodo è ancora più interessante.
In Asia,
In Asia,
this is how you tally.
questo è il modo in cui si fa.
1,
1,
2,
2,
3,
3,
4,
4,
5.
5.
Now, when I first saw this,
Quando io l'ho visto la
I
prima
thought,
volta ho pensato,
this is cruelty towards children.
ma questa è una forma di crudeltà verso l'infanzia.
It's so complicated
È complicato
and seems so unnatural.
e non è naturale.
But actually, it's fantastic
È fantastico.
because this, it's the Chinese character,
È anche il carattere
Japanese and Korea as well,
cinese, ma è utilizzato anche in Giappone e in Corea,
for the word correct.
che indica la parola corretto.
So it's almost like a poem.
È quasi una poesia.
It's a way of using words
Modo di
and
utilizzare
to embrace numbers.
le parole perché diano forma ai numeri.
In England, we tend to see numbers as one thing, and you can be a number person, and then you can be a word person,
Uno o è una persona
and never the twain will
che
meet.
prende i numeri o le parole e le due non si incontrano mai.
But in Asia, that's not the case. Numbers and words are all together, and you can have fun with them.
Mescolano e ci si può giocare.
And also because there is a distinct order to the way you write all Chinese and Japanese characters,
Con cui si scrivono gli ideogrammi cinesi e
this
giapponesi,
helps to teach you to
questo vi aiuta
talk, to write as well.
anche a imparare a scrivere.
Now, I'm remembering what comes my next slide because of the technical problems. I don't have the next one. Yes. This idea that numbers are something to play with, to have fun with,
Qualcosa con cui si gioca,
is evident in one of the biggest contributions of Japan to world culture in recent years, the Sudoku.
e che è il Sudoku.
I went to meet in Japan the man who calls himself the godfather
Si chiama il
of Sudoku,
padrino del Sudoku.
and his name is Maki Kaji.
Maki Kaji.
And he sees himself as an entertainer of numbers.
Si considera una persona che gioca con i numeri,
And no sooner,
giocatore di numeri.
no sooner than we were talking, he said, I have a new passion.
Mi ha detto, guarda, ho una passione, una nuova passione.
It is taking photographs
Fotografo
of car license plates.
le targhe delle automobili.
And he showed me 2 of them.
Fatte vedere 2.
I don't know if anyone can see why these number plates are interesting.
Perché sono interessanti in particolare queste targhe qua?
Anyone?
C'è qualcuno che l'ha indovinato?
Okay, great. Because the top one is 3 times 5 is 15,
3 per 5 fa 15,
and the bottom one is 4 times 1 is 4.
4 per 1 4.
So these are lines in the times table.
Queste sono delle righe, delle tabelline.
And wherever he goes, whenever he sees a license plate that is a line in the times table,
Se corrisponde
he takes a picture.
alla tabellina, fa la foto.
And he hopes to have an exhibition
Di organizzare una mostra
when he gets all 81.
di cui ha completato le tabelline.
And this seems to me it's so representative of Japanese culture
Questo rappresenti molto chiaramente la
that
cultura giapponese.
we see so many numbers in our lives,
Noi vediamo così tanti numeri.
we tend to want to run away.
A un certo punto vogliamo sfuggire, vogliamo andare.
But in Japan, they embrace them. They have fun with them.
Si divertono con i numeri.
Now, the greatest way that Japan is different to the West in its approach to numbers, or the most conspicuous way,
Il modo in cui si parla e si affrontano i numeri. Guardate adesso,
is the abacus.
questo è l'abaco.
So the abacus, and I brought an abacus to show you what one it is like. It's in fact, when we lived in Brazil for 5 years, they had something very similar to this,
Cosa molto simile a questo.
but they just used it to keep rhythm at the carnival every year.
Tenere il ritmo al carnevale tutti gli anni.
So an abacus, there I have it vertically, but actually you have to use it horizontally.
Utilizzarlo ponendolo in orizzontale.
And each rod
E ciascuno di questi bastoni
represents a digit between 0 and 9,
un numero tra 0 e 9
And basically, you can calculate addition, multiplication, subtraction much faster on an abacus than you could with pencil and paper. 1 million Japanese learn the abacus every year, even though you don't need to learn it for school. And they learn it at one of 20,000 after-school abacus clubs. And I've forgotten this one. This is, it shows that when the electronic calculator was being introduced in the 1970s, they introduced this abacus calculator. Now, you might think that this is because you would do the sum with the abacus and then check that you were right with the calculator, but it was the other way around, because they didn't trust the electronic calculator. So the abacus was there just to check that it made the right answer. So I went to one of these abacus clubs. And basically what you do is you time yourself doing addition, multiplication, and other sums. And I took a video, which I'm going to show you now, in which this student will add 5 absurdly large numbers. And look at the fingers to see how she does it.
Okay, I will give you big number, 10 to 14 digit, 5 numbers, addition only. Are you ready? Starting with 7,125,180,341,609, 40,236,412,097,386, $1,793,468,520, $982,509,182,467, $17,345,906,273. That's all. How much did you get? Okay, please say answer in English.
48,260,3,240,996,255.
That's right. Well done. Well done.
So the girl was 7 years old, and there are several interesting things about that. She got it perfectly right, but she made a little mistake, which is that she couldn't remember how to say 55. Because one of the great problems that we in Europe have in understanding numbers is that we have terrible words for numbers. 50. Like in French, in English, in Italian, it doesn't make sense. In Japan, you count like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 1, 10, 2, 10, 3, 10, 4. 2, 10. Then 2, 10, 1, 2, 10, 3. So 50 is 5, 10. And studies show that European children are 1 year behind their equivalents in the Far East in basic arithmetic. And of all the different cultural reasons, the words are very significant.
Le parole hanno un peso enorme.
Because we get to 10, and then in English, 11, 12,
11, 11, poi
it really makes no sense at all.
cioè parole prive di senso.
The other interesting thing about that
Cosa interessante, sempre del video che avete visto,
is that when we add numbers
noi sommiamo dei numeri
and when we multiply numbers,
e moltiplichiamo poi dei numeri,
we start with the smallest column first.
cominciamo prima di tutto da quello più piccolo.
So we start with the units, then do the tens, then the hundreds, and we go that way.
Poi le centinaia, insomma andiamo in quella direzione lì.
When you calculate with the abacus,
Mentre quando si usa l'abaco,
you start with the biggest numbers
col numero più grande,
and then go to the smallest
poi
numbers.
vai al numero più piccolo.
So right from the beginning,
Fin dall'inizio
you have an understanding of the size of the number,
dimensione di quel numero
and you're zoning in to what the answer is.
e si focalizza sulla risposta.
Now, oops. Oh, hang on. Now, in Japan,
In Giappone
no one has proved
nessuno ha dimostrato
that
che
if you spend your time doing the abacus, it means that you're better at mathematics.
il tempo a esercitarsi sull'abaco siete più bravi in matematica.
But what they say is that
Quello che si dice,
when you are given a concrete example of numbers,
avete un esempio
when you see it physically,
dei numeri, quando vedete fisicamente i numeri,
it makes it much easier.
diventa molto più facile.
So I went to this
Quindi io sono andato
school,
a questa scuola.
and it wasn't that I was going to the school of,
Non è che andasse a scuola
I don't know, nerds or geeks
a
or,
una scuola di
peop-
secchioni
or just the high achievers.
o di quelli che sono i più bravi di tutti.
These were just like a bunch of kids.
Questo era un gruppo di ragazzini,
And they loved it. They found it fun.
si divertivano.
And when I asked the teacher, I said,
Quando ho chiesto all'insegnante,
in the abacus,
gli ho detto, ma
the way that in maths class you get some people who are brilliant and it's easy, and some people who just cannot do it.
matematica molto facile, ce ne sono altri che proprio non la capiscono.
They say that doesn't happen in abacus.
Mi hanno risposto, questo non succede.
Yes, you get some people who are faster than others,
Alcuni che sono più veloci degli altri,
but everyone can do it.
ma tutti sono in grado di farlo.
They had never met someone who just couldn't do it.
Non ho mai incontrato un bambino che non fosse in grado.
When I went to ask Yoji Miyamoto, who is the teacher here,
Sono andato da Yoji Miyamoto, che è l'insegnante qua.
what is the point of learning to calculate so fast where we never need to use it in the modern world?
Per esempio, calcolare così in fretta, non è che dobbiamo usarlo nel mondo moderno.
He asked me,
E lui mi ha detto,
well, what is the point
dice, ma che serve
of learning to run
imparare a
26 miles as fast as possible?
26 miglia alla massima velocità, per esempio.
But people do that every weekend,
Ma tutti
training for the
i
marathon.
C'è la gente che lo fa perché si allena per la maratona.
It's this idea that training one's brain
L'idea è che se si allena la mente o per
to be as
forza,
excellent as possible
si allena la mente perché raggiunga il massimo livello possibile.
is no different from a sport.
È un pochettino come uno sport mentale.
And in fact, there are other ways that learning the abacus is just like a sport.
L'abaco è un pochettino come uno sport.
When you get good at the abacus,
Quando diventate bravi, per esempio,
you get dans,
a questo punto si ricevono dei dan,
which is just like in karate and judo.
un pochettino come nel karate o nel judo, nel jiu-jitsu.
And there is a huge competitive world
C'è un mondo di gare.
of the abacus. And I went to this
Sono andato
regional abacus competition.
a questa gara regionale,
The guy stands at the front,
quello che è seduto, vedete scusate che sta in piedi,
reading at the numbers as fast as he can,
legge i numeri a una velocità impressionante.
and children
I bambini
answer it.
rispondono alle domande.
This is what they can win, which is a trophy,
È un trofeo,
someone holding an abacus.
una vittoria che tiene in mano l'abaco.
This year, I went back to Japan,
Sono tornato in Giappone,
and I went to the biggest event
sono andato a vedere
in the abacus calendar,
questo evento del calendario dell'abaco,
the National Abacus Championships.
il campionato nazionale.
And you can see that they all have numbers,
Hanno tutti dei
and
numeri
it's sponsored by Panasonic.
sponsorizzati dalla Panasonic.
It's a really big event.
È veramente un grosso evento.
And there are lots of different categories, just like a big sporting event.
Come qualunque evento sportivo.
There is one where
Una, per esempio,
the person reads out the numbers
per cui la persona
and they answer with the abacus.
risponde con gli abaci.
And it sounds like thunder. There's so many beads going.
Una tempesta, ci sono così tante palline o calcoli, come si chiamano, dell'abaco.
And there's another category
C'è un'altra categoria,
that is completely silent.
invece silenziosa.
Because when you get very good at the abacus,
Quando diventate molto bravi,
you don't need to have an abacus anymore.
non c'è più bisogno di avere un abaco fisico in mano.
You just need to imagine it in your brain.
Semplicemente immaginarlo in testa.
So you have it in your brain,
Quindi ce l'avete in testa,
you're told the sum, or you read the sum,
leggete la somma,
you move the beads in your
nel
brain,
cervello spostate le palline
and you tell the answer.
e avete la risposta subito.
And this is called Anzan.
E questo si chiama Anzan.
And the largest, or the highest profile, the most exciting event
L'evento più importante,
in this championship
più alto profilo in questo campionato
is called Flash Anzan,
si chiama Flash Anzan.
where numbers are flashed at you
Sono proiettati rapidissimamente
and you must add them up.
e bisogna sommarli, bisogna addizionarli in testa, a mente.
Now, each of the numbers
Ciascuno dei numeri
is 3 digits long,
ha 3 cifre,
so between 100 and 999.
100 e 999.
And if I was flashed at them,
E
1,
se me ne fate
bum,
uno,
bum,
due,
bum,
così,
maybe then you could type it into a computer
potrei mettere
to find the
una
answer,
calcolatrice per
or maybe even write it down very fast.
forse potrei addirittura scrivere,
In Flash Anzan,
ma nel Flash Anzan
they're flashed at you so fast
fatti vedere così velocemente
that the only way
l'unico modo
to do the sum
per fare il calcolo
is using Anzan
è utilizzare l'Anzan
because you cannot write them down.
perché non è più possibile scriverli.
I'm going to show you a clip just now.
Vedere adesso un video.
根本你们你这也没有人嘛，别骗
Oh, yes, they get it completely right.
Ha dato risposta giusta.
So what they're doing,
Quindi quello che stanno facendo,
they see the first number
vedono il primo numero,
and they just see it as a position on the abacus.
c'è già una posizione delle palline.
They see the second number
Nel secondo
and they just add it to become a new position.
riposizionato le palline.
And they reposition
Riposizionano
until at the end they just read it out.
il numero.
Now, they cannot remember any of the numbers,
Si ricordano i numeri.
nor can they retain any of the intermediate sums.
In grado di darvi le somme intermedie.
All they can do is they can just read out what is there,
In grado di fare e di leggere la somma
which is the answer.
e che è la risposta.
Now, Flash Anzan is
Flash Anzan
a huge fad in Japan.
è veramente da gran moda in Giappone.
You can get it for your, there are lots of websites to learn it. You can get it on your Nintendo,
Potete metterlo su Nintendo.
and there are even TV programs where the best in the country compete against each other.
Sfidano l'uno contro l'altro.
Now, I showed you 15 digits
15
in 3 seconds.
3 secondi.
The world record, which I saw,
Mondiale, quello che ho visto io.
15 digits in 1.7
1,7
seconds.
secondi.
So this is just to see. Now, one thing is interesting to try and do.
Cosa interessante da
Try and even read one of these numbers.
vedere questi numeri.
Just to read one out. Just see if you can do it.
Se riuscite a leggerne almeno uno.
And remember that the person who is adding it up can add them all up.
Sono in grado di farla con la somma.
Okay, did anyone get that?
Riuscite a leggere un numero?
So,
Uno, pochissimi.
there is another interesting thing about the Anzan and the abacus, is that when we learn to count normally, we use the same part of the brain that we use for language. But when we count using the abacus, we use a different part of the brain which we use for our understanding of space.
quella che ha a che fare con lo spazio.
Yeah, our visio-spatial sense.
Una specie di senso viso-spaziale.
And what this means
Questo cosa significa?
is that it is possible
Significa che è
to do flash Anzan
fare il flash Anzan
whilst
mentre
using the other part of the brain
utilizza l'altra parte
for language.
che è quella del linguaggio.
So what the teacher showed me,
Quello che l'insegnante mi ha fatto vedere,
which I'll show you now,
che adesso vi farò vedere,
is another clip
è un'altra clip.
with two 10-year-old
Ci
girls.
sono due ragazze di 10 anni
They are
e
counting 30 digits in 20
hanno
seconds
30 cifre da contare in 20 secondi.
at the same time
Nel contempo
as playing a number game. No, as a language game, a word game.
stanno facendo un gioco di parole.
This word game is called shiritori,
Si chiama Shiritori.
and the first person says shiritori.
La prima persona dice Shiritori.
The second person must say a new word
La persona deve dire una parola
that begins with the last syllable of the previous word.
prima della parola precedente.
And then the next person says another word
La persona successiva dice un'altra
whose
parola.
first syllable is the last syllable of the previous word.
Deve essere sempre l'ultima sillaba della parola precedente.
And let's see how they get on.
Vediamo cosa fanno queste ragazze.
はい。
しりとり、ムゴ、ゴリラ、ラッパ、パンダ、ダチョウ、牛、鹿、カラス、スズメ、メダカ、カメ、目玉焼き、
はい、答えせーの。
17,602
Yeah, they've got it completely right. Now, you might have thought that I got there and I was filming all day until they did it right once.
Filmato finché non l'hanno fatto giusto una volta sola.
No, they got it right first time.
È che la prima volta l'hanno azzeccato.
And there are other interesting things about
Ci sono delle altre cose
that.
interessanti.
If you notice, they were moving in rhythm.
Si muovevano, avevano un certo ritmo.
And there's obviously something
Chiaramente c'è
physical
qualcosa di
or using our motor senses
penso che si utilizzi
to calculate as well.
motori anche per calcolare.
And
Hanno
it's-
utilizzato il movimento per calcolare il numero.
I once interviewed the world champion at mental arithmetic,
Mondiale del
who is an Indian girl who had learnt to count with an abacus,
imparato a contare con un abaco.
and she moved her hands like this when she was calculating
Calcolava mente, muoveva
because of the memory of the abacus.
la memoria del movimento.
And I asked her,
Gli ho chiesto,
if I held your hands together,
ti trattengo le mani,
could you still calculate?
riusciresti ancora a calcolare?
And she said no.
E mi ha detto no.
So obviously, there's something about learning the physicality of counting
Della fisicità del
is important
contare.
also for counting.
Importante per il calcolo mentale.
Once I'd been to Japan,
Una volta che
I came back to London and I went to meet
sono andato
the professor of cognitive neuroscience
in neuroscienza cognitiva
at the University College London,
alla University College a Londra,
who studies mathematics and the brain,
studia la matematica e il cervello.
and he had never seen anything like this.
Mai visto una cosa del genere.
His jaw dropped and said,
Bocca aperta.
we need to study this,
Dobbiamo studiarlo.
because the abacus, even though it is the most ancient calculating tool that we have,
Lo strumento di calcolo più antico,
is still really
in realtà,
the least understood.
quello meno capito.
And by looking into how the abacus and the brain work,
Il modo in cui funzionano il cervello e l'abaco,
maybe in the future we will be able to make counting in numbers
di far sì
easier and more accessible
che diventino più facili,
to,
calcolare diventi più facile
to many more people.
e che molte più persone riescano ad accedere.
So thank you very much.
Grazie moltissimo.
That's sort of the end of my talk.
Grazie, grazie Alex Bellos.
Allora, volevo fare una domanda.
I would like to ask a question. I read in a book that the Maya population had a system which was in base 5, and that included also 0. Is that true?
Yes. I'm not that much of an expert
Non
on
sono un
Maya,
esperto dei Maya,
but I do know
ma
that
so
they had
che avevano
a positional system
un sistema con posizioni
and they had a symbol
ed avevano un
that
simbolo
represented
che
nothing in that
rappresentava
position,
nulla in quella particolare
but they
posizione.
didn't treat that
Non
symbol
trattavano quel simbolo
just like they treated all
come
the other numbers
tutti
within the
gli altri
system.
numeri che facevano parte del
So they were
sistema.
almost there.
In altre parole, c'erano quasi, mancava poco.
Now, what they did have is they did have a base 20 system,
E che avevano un sistema in base 20
which
che
is not so unusual.
non è così insolito.
The most popular base that we've had is base 10
Avuto è la base 10
for this reason,
per questo motivo.
but also
Ma
there are many examples of base 5
anche molti esempi di calcolo in base
and base 20.
e 20, mani e piedi.
And in France, for example, we say 80 for 80,
80 per dire 80.
which seems to be a fragment
Parrebbe essere
from
un
a
elemento residuo
base 20 system
di un sistema
in
di
use
calcolo in base
in Europe.
20 che era utilizzato in Europa.
Actually, there's one more thing just to say about the Maya, because lots of people now are interested in the Maya, because I think on the 20th of December, the world is going to collapse. Okay? This is because of a misunderstanding of the Mayan calendar.
Incomprensione del calendario Maya.
But the Maya were interesting because
Interessante perché
their their calendar
i Maya
had
avevano un calendario
a 13-day week
che aveva
and a 20-day week
di 13 giorni e una di 20 giorni.
that went simultaneously. So it wasn't
Correvano lo stesso tempo.
like they have the first of the month, the second of the month, the third of the month.
Il secondo, il terzo
It would
del
be
mese, ma non era così, nel senso che aveva
the first of the first month,
sarebbe il primo
then the
giorno
second of the second month, then the third of the third month,
mese, poi il terzo giorno
and both systems were revolving.
continuano a
So it's
girare
only
il ciclo.
after 260 days
Dopo 260 giorni,
that the same day in the same month
lo stesso giorno e lo stesso mese
coincide again,
coincidono ancora una volta.
which I think is quite interesting.
Pare che questo sia abbastanza interessante.
Yeah.
Prego, buonasera. Domanda che arriva da...
Now we have a question that is from Venice, from the Future Center, Pino Zappalà. Yes, it comes from Rita De Mul. The last videos were really very surprising. They were amazing. Are there games that we could give our children next Christmas to develop this mathematical knowledge?
Yeah, well, you need to start
Or
with
a
an
skill?
abacus. I was showing you the top champions in abacus. It would take several years to get that good.
Diversi anni di allenamento per arrivare a
And you
quel
need to be
livello.
practicing
E poi,
a few hours
diciamo,
every week,
ogni
maybe
settimana
half an hour
darci
every day.
un po' di ore, diciamo mezz'ora, un'ora al giorno.
But I think that if you were to start now,
Che se doveste iniziare
for
ora,
example, if you were an elementary school teacher
voi siete un insegnante elementare
and you spent
e
1 hour a week,
un'ora a settimana.
by the time they'd finished elementary
Quando
school,
hanno finito le scuole elementari,
they would be able to do things like this.
sarebbero in grado di fare delle cose del genere.
Especially if there were two schools and you could have competitions,
Se due scuole le metteste l'una contro l'altra in gara,
that would be good.
quello sarebbe una bella idea.
Allora c'è una domanda e poi se riesco ne inserisco una io piccolissima. Prego.
Buonasera, senta, volevo chiedere,
Good evening. I would like to ask you why are days counted on base 60? That's 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and then 24 hours. Where does that come from?
Yeah, this is a question
Questa è una domanda
which
che
dates back to Babylon.
ci riporta a Babilonia.
Because we know that's when they started
Vedete, è lì
using this
che hanno iniziato
base 60 system.
ad utilizzare questo sistema in base 60.
But why they chose it,
Perché l'abbiano scelto?
no one knows for sure.
Nessuno ne è proprio sicuro.
One theory
C'è una teoria
is that 60 times 60
60 per 60
is 360,
è 360,
which is very close to the number of days in the year.
molto vicino al numero di giorni in un anno.
The other suggestion
L'altro
would
suggerimento
be it's a almost survival of the fittest
è
system,
che praticamente la sopravvivenza del sistema,
because 60
perché 60
is a highly divisible
è
number.
un numero che può essere diviso per moltissimi altri, da moltissimi o per moltissimi altri numeri.
Because we can divide 60
Possiamo dividere 60
into half, which is 30,
per 2, 30,
into a third, which is 20,
che è 20,
a quarter,
un quarto,
which is 15,
che è 15,
a fifth, which is 12,
che è 12,
a sixth,
un
which is
sesto,
10.
che è 10.
It's the lowest number
Il numero
that
più
you can
piccolo
divide,
che possa essere diviso
which
per
helps
quel numero di numeri, ciò aiuta
when your number system
nel momento in
is
cui
not very
il
developed
sistema numerico
and
è
writing out
abbastanza
fractions
elementare,
is really
e
complicated.
quindi, per esempio, le frazioni sono troppo complesse.
So actually 60
Quindi in realtà il 60
is really useful.
è un numero molto utile.
If we had, say, 100 minutes in an hour,
100 minuti in un'ora,
you would never be able to say,
non potreste mai dire
I'll be there in a third of an hour,
sarò lì tra un terzo
because
di
you'd have to
un'ora.
say, I'll be there in 33 and a
Dovreste
third
dire, sarò lì
minutes.
tra 33,3 minuti,
Well, now we can say, I'll be there in 20 minutes.
mentre io adesso posso dirvi sarò lì tra 20 minuti.
So 60
Quindi 60
is very robust,
è un numero molto robusto.
and maybe that hasn't something to do with it.
Forse questo ha a che fare con il motivo per cui è
Because
stato scelto.
since the Babylonians, it was then adopted by the Greeks,
Prima in Babilonia,
and then in the
poi i
West,
Greci, poi tutto il mondo occidentale.
and nothing has pushed it away.
E in fondo non c'è nulla che sia riuscito a scalzarlo,
Even though the French,
anche se i
the,
francesi
the French during the Revolution,
durante la rivoluzione
they
francese
abolished
hanno
this
abolito
division,
questo tipo di
and they had
e avevano introdotto
10 hours
10 ore
divided
divise
into 100 minutes each hour.
in 100 minuti l'una.
And for 3 years,
Per 3
they had watches
avevano degli orologi
with 10,
con 10,
and it was a complete disaster
è stato un disastro totale,
because you can't divide it very well.
non è molto divisibile.
So the French metric system
Tutto il sistema
for money
francese ha funzionato per
was very good, for measuring is very good,
l'azione,
but for time, it's a disaster.
Mentre rispondeva mi veniva in mente che Lagrange...
While you were answering, I was thinking that the fact that Lagrange, who was the head of the committee that then introduced the metric system to convince the colleagues that it was easier to calculate in base 10, provocatively said that you should calculate on base 11, maybe because in his family they were 11 children, but the base 10 was certainly more successful. But the question is another. That is to say, computers calculate with a binary system. This means that all numbers are 0 and 1. This method, which clearly works very well with computers, how does it work, or how would it work if applied to the human mind?
With using binary
nell'utilizzo di sistemi binari
is that, well, with binary, the units would be ones, the tens would be twos,
sarebbero dei 2,
and then the hundreds would be
migliaia sarebbero
4,
4,
the thousands would be 8,
sarebbero 8,
so we would get up to 8, hang on, 8, 16, 32. So if we wanted to say 64,
dire 64,
we need to use 7 digits.
devo utilizzare 7 cifre.
Why? It's too complicated.
Quindi
It's
solo
too
una
complicated.
macchina molto veloce ma molto stupida può usare questo metodo.
No, the reason why
Il motivo per cui
computers use it
Abbiamo soltanto
is that,
corrente o non corrente.
yeah, on, off, yes, no,
sì, no, acceso, spento,
yeah. So that's the basis. But
questa è la base.
we understand more subtlety than that.
Noi siamo un pochettino più sottili.
This is the second question from Venice. Which ethnic groups have developed the greatest mathematical skills and why?
There are many levels to answer this, but you would have to say that over the last 500 years, the ethnic group who have developed highest mathematical skills are the French. There are more great French mathematicians, even if you don't include Lagrange from France. That's what I say. So if you exclude him, even if Italy has a Lagrange, and even now, France produces per capita more great mathematicians. And there are many reasons for this. One of them is that France has the most elite system, a very elitist system of education, which is very unfashionable in the rest of the world. So if you are very good at maths, you go to the École Normale, and only about 50 students a year go to this one university to study mathematics. And every single French winner of the Fields Medal have all studied there. Now, England are quite good, but we're not even as elitist as the French.
Grazie, con questo concludiamo la nostra
Thank you.
serata. Grazie a Alex.
Thank you very much. And with this, we have finished this evening. Thank you very much, Alex Bellos. You were very interesting.